Hi, my name's Kristiann and I'm here to do the sew along video for the Atlas Mittens. This is a mitten that's designed to be used with upcycled materials such as felted sweater, leather, and fur. And the hope is that you're going to be making some super stylish, super cozy mittens for yourself and also for your friends and family as gifts for Christmas or just throughout the winter. So let's get started. All right, let's start by gathering the materials. I've sourced a few things from vintage shops in my area. If you need a hand with sourcing upcycled materials, I've created a video on how to do that up here, so check it out. So the first thing I've got is my sweater, which is going to be the face of the mitten, and then I've got a leather jacket that is super 70s and has lots of leather to work with. And then I've got a little fur stole. This would normally be a little collar of a jacket, but we're gonna use it for the cuffs of the mitten. And then I've just bought some yardage for the lining. This is just some sweater fleece knit, so that'll be nice and soft and warm. And in between the lining and the outer layer, I'm gonna put a little bit of insulation fabric. So this is a Pellon insole fleece, and it's gonna help to keep the warmth from my hand inside the mitten. Instead of insole fleece, if you do want to have another layer inside the lining for warmth, you can use a layer of thin wool, and that's going to help to give a little bit of extra insulation as well. Okay, so let's go through the tools and notions that you'll need. So I'm going to suggest that you get a little bit of hard paper. This could be Bristol board, and we're going to be using it to transfer the pattern from the PDF onto this paper so that we have a hard final pattern to trace onto the fabric. It's easier to trace against a hard edge than a soft edge that you would normally have with the PDF printer paper. So let's start with that. And in order to transfer the PDF pattern onto this paper, we're going to use a pattern making tracing wheel. This has sharp pointy edges. So this will leave perforated lines through the two layers of the paper, allowing us to trace our pattern. And then we're going to need some pencil to make the final markings on the pattern, some shears to cut out your fabric, paper scissors to cut out your pattern, some measuring tape to find our measurements for our size and to help us with cutting. And I'm going to suggest you get a sharp X-Acto knife. This is going to be used if you're cutting your fur. You can use scissors, but if you've got one of these, then grab them. It'll be a little bit easier for you. And also grab a pen. This is helpful in marking our leather. And instead of pins, grab some Wonder clips. If you don't have Wonder clips, you can use those little binder clips. Since we can't pin leather, it will leave holes in the leather. This is how we're going to be binding our fabrics together when we're sewing. It's helpful to have a piece of chalk around just in case we need to make any pattern markings. And stitch ripper is good for helping us to deconstruct the upcycled garments, especially the fur. Also, just if we make mistakes, which is inevitable, and some sewing needles. I would suggest using a size 14 or 16 regular sharp needle. I've had a lot of luck sewing both the felted knit sweater and the leather with this. I'd like to try and avoid you having to get two needles, a leather needle and this needle. So try this first on your sewing machine with your fabrics, test it out, see if it works. If you're finding that when you're sewing the leather that you're getting slipped stitches, then you're going to need a leather sewing needle. But if you've got a size 14 or 16 in your needle collection, try this first before you run out and buy a leather needle. And your sewing thread, I'd suggest just getting a color that matches the leather that you're working with for the project. Just regular thread will work for you. If you have a walking foot, then I would use that when you're sewing. This is going to help to feed the density of the fabric through the machine, giving you even stitches. We're going to be using a hand sewing needle. Just make sure it's a sturdy one because sometimes fur can be a little tricky to stitch through. This is where we're going to be applying the final stitch, applying the fur to the lining. And this is going to help us with our hand sewing needle. So if you grab a little thimble, that'll help to push the needle through. And that's everything we need. So next, we're going to just talk about how to prepare the upcycled fabrics and get that ready for cutting out the pattern. All right, to find the size of my hand and my mitten, I'm going to use my dominant hand, which is my right hand, and a measuring tape. And we're going to just measure around our knuckle and along the length of our hand. So going around the knuckle, I'm going to measure, and that's 7.5 inches. Now, to find the length, I'm going to go from the crease of my wrist along to the tip of my middle finger. And I'm going to get about 7 3/8. So let's take a look at the size chart. So I'm 7.5 inches in circumference. I'll circle that measurement. And I'm 7 3/8 in length. So that's in between these measurements, but closer to the 7.5. So I'll circle that. So I'm a straight up medium on my hand. If you were, let's say, an 8 in length and a 7.5 in circumference, you would just choose the size that is your larger size. So that would be a large. So I'm going to trace out a medium in hard paper, and then I'll get cutting on my fabric. Okay, so I've got my PDF pattern printed out and assembled. You can, if you want, just cut this pattern out as is and use this pattern to cut out your fabrics. Another option is to transfer this pattern onto hard paper. Having a hard paper pattern is great if you want to make this mitten over and over again, because that pattern is going to last a long time. But it's also really nice when you're transferring the pattern onto the fabric, because it's easy to have a hard edge to trace against. So I'm just going to walk you through how to transfer this pattern onto hard paper. But if you'd rather skip this step, then move on to just cutting out this pattern, the PDF, and then cutting out your fabric. So I'm just going to walk along with my tracing wheel along size medium and carefully just copy those lines. I'm going to be making sure that I get the whole outline along with any notches and the grain line of each piece. And when it comes to the grain line, I really just trace either end. I don't really bother to trace the whole middle area, because then later I'll just use my ruler and align those two end points to create a straight line. When you're tracing an area like this and you've got all of these converging lines, it's really hard to know exactly where to go. So what I would say is, come along this line, and where you feel like you have no idea where to go from there, come over and trace from this side, and those lines will just meet up. Alright, before we remove this pattern piece, we need to make sure that the pieces that we've traced underneath are properly annotated with the information that we've got here. So I'm going to start by just making sure that I know that the piece that I've traced is either A, C, D, or F. So let's just mark that first. A, C, D, and over here, G. Okay, so I know on camera it's really hard to see these dots, but in person you will see them, and you're just gonna take a ruler and start tracing along those dots, and your pattern will start to appear. So when you're using this drafting ruler, you're going to need to bend the ruler around the curve. So put the ruler against the dots, trace until the ruler veers away from the dots, and then pivot on the pencil, and then realign the ruler with the dots, and then continue drawing. Okay, so now I'm just gonna take my pattern and just take a look at the annotation and just copy that information over there. So I have piece F, this is the lining palm 2, and then I'm just gonna make a note that it's version 1, 2, and 3, and I'm gonna cut 2 of fabric 3 lining, and then optional insulation. So I just want to make sure when I'm cutting I have all that information that I would normally have on my pattern, and I'm going to do that on each of the pieces. Okay, so I've traced out my pattern pieces, everything is cut out, everything is marked, all of the pattern information has been transferred, and now I'm ready to cut out all of my fabric. So let's get into that. All right, so I've got the upcycled garments here, and I just want to explain a little bit about how to prepare each one before we start cutting out the pattern. So the sweater needs to be felted before we cut out anything. This is so that we increase the density of the fabric, and we also prevent it from fraying, so that when the project is cut out, it doesn't fall apart on us. It will also make the mitten a lot warmer. So what you want to do is stick it in the washer and dryer on a hot cycle, and then that's going to bind the fibers together and increase the density of the sweater. Once that comes out of the dryer, we're just going to cut the seams of the sweater so that we have a few separate pieces so that we can cut the pattern as single layers. So with the sweater felted, I'm just going to go ahead and just cut along the side seam on both sides. And then I'm going to cut along the sleeve seam just to separate the sleeves. So ideally we're going to be able to have a few different panels here. We'll have the front panel, the back panel, and the sleeves. And we'll be able to get a lot of mittens out of that. And it's worth just cutting the sleeve seam on the underarm portion of the sleeve as well. What I'm going to do on the cuff of the sleeve is leave that intact, and I'm just going to cut around just above the just above the cuff. I may be able to use this cuff on a pair of mittens, so I'm just going to recycle that. All right, so I've got a sleeve panel, another one over here, which I'll cut the sleeve seam of later, and I've got the front and the back. So now when I'm ready to cut the pattern, I'll just be cutting on single layers, and then I can best place my pieces so that I have the motif of the sweater design placed exactly where I want it on the pattern piece. So let's move on to the leather jacket. All right, so I've got this huge jacket here, and I definitely don't need all of it for the project. One thing I like to consider is just how big my pattern pieces are, and try and use a piece or 2 pieces or however many you need that will allow for the pattern pieces you need to fit onto that area. And another thing when you're using upcycled garments is just consider anything that you can recycle so you can use later. So let's look on the inside, and we've got some really nice wool lining here. This could be used as lining for a mitten. I'm going to cut this out at some point later and keep that aside. I'll wash it, maybe I'll felt that to increase the density and make it more warm, and use that in another pair of mittens. I've also got some buttons, and just keep in mind other elements of the project that you can use for something else, so we're not throwing it away. So I'm just going to cut out a piece of this jacket that is big enough for the amount that I need for my mittens. And I'm just making sure that I'm avoiding seams here. So I'm basically cutting on all of the seams of the leather because we don't want to have a seam in the middle of the palm of the mitten. So you can just use the seams as a guide for where to cut on the leather. And there may be several layers here. So if anything is attached, just cut it out, separate the layers. You may want to grab a stitch ripper to help with this. And you don't have to be too tidy. Just make sure that you're focusing on just creating a separate layer of leather. All right. So let's just leave it at that for now. And let's just take a look. So we've got a leather panel here. I might need one more. We'll see how the pieces fit on. But for now, I'm just going to be thinking about avoiding this pocket area, but all of this is good to cut. Areas like this where I've got the buttonholes from where the button was attached, I don't want to include that in the mitten, so I'll just cut around areas like that. And if there's spots like this on the back, we can just remove that or just cut around it. But I'm just going to get rid of this pocket bag and just tidy things up as much as possible so everything can lay as flat as can be. And that panel is good to go. Okay, so I've got my stole. This is going to be used for the fur cuff of the mitten, and we're going to need to deconstruct this so that the lining comes apart and we've just got the fur layer to cut. So I've got 3 different stoles here at different stages of their deconstruction. This one here, the lining's been removed, and you might find it's got a little bit of fiber fill and grosgrain ribbon around the perimeter. So the lining needs to come off, all of the other elements need to come off, and then what you will be left with is just the fur. This is going to be how we need to cut the project out. So with everything bare, just your layer of fur, you want to get it to this point so that we can cut out our pattern piece. All right, so we're going to start by cutting the sweater knit. This is going to be cut using piece A, which is going to be the base of our mitten. And what I want you to do is just lay the sweater so that it's just a single layer. And notice that the bottom band may be kind of giving an inward pull here. So let's just cut that band off so that this lays as flat as possible. All right, so then you're going to take your pattern piece and I'm going to get you to just fold it along the grain line. Normally, when you have a pattern, the grain line is going to align to the selvage. That will ensure that the pattern piece is straight on the grain. Now we're working with an upcycled sweater, so we don't have a selvage, but you can kind of visualize straight lines formed by the knit, and that's what we're going to use to align this straight line to. It's easiest to do that when you have a folded edge. So let's just tuck the sweater out of the way for the moment, and we're just going to fold along that grain line. And it's useful just to kind of take your ruler and just press along that edge to get a crisp fold. Okay, and now let's take a quick look at the sweater again. And I don't know what your sweater looks like, but you might have like a dominant element on your sweater. I've got this stripe here that I would consider my dominant stripe, and I want that to kind of run across the middle of my hand. So when I'm aligning my 2 pieces, I want to make sure that that stripe is positioned exactly in the same place across both pieces. So what's helpful to do is to create a fold line in this direction that you can use to align your motif with. So the next thing we're going to do is just fold that pattern piece in half, again in the opposite direction of the grain line. Okay, so we've got these 2 folds. Now let's lay out the piece onto the sweater. And the first thing I want to do is fold my pattern piece along the grain line. And I'm going to position the folded edge along a straight line of my knit. And then once that's done, I'm going to just take a look at that halfway fold line to align my motif along the center of my piece. So once that's kind of positioned where I'm happy with it, I'm going to unfold the piece and lay it straight out and flat onto the sweater. And if you have a pattern weight, that's really helpful to lay this down. If not, you're just going to hold it down as you're cutting. But I'm just going to place that down so that it's laying nice and flat on my piece. I'm going to recommend that you don't pin this pattern piece to the sweater. It can get quite ripply because of the density of the sweater, so weighing it down or just holding it down as you cut is probably the best option. And when you're cutting this, don't cut out the notch. We're going to deal with that later. But cutting into this sweater is going to affect the integrity of the knit, so just let's leave that out for now. I'm just going to shift my weight to cut this little bottom edge here. Okay, so I've got my first piece, and you can start to visualize the mitten and what it's going to look like. Now we're going to cut the second piece, so we're just going to repeat that again. So fold grain line, align your center line to the motif. And this is just really important because you just want to make sure that both of these pieces are going to have the motif in the same place. All right, and just do that one more time for your second hand. Okay, so there you have your 2 mitten faces, and the last thing we're going to do is transfer those notches. All right, so let's lay that out one more time and place your pattern piece on top of it one last time. And I'm just going to take a needle and thread, and I'm just going to form some little stitches, sort of overcasting the edge, and this is just to give myself an indication of where that notch is. And it's just a safe way of doing it because it doesn't affect the knit. It doesn't cut into it in any way. And we'll just make sure that that's visible. It doesn't need to be beautiful. And just do that on either side. Oops. I would just go 2 or 3 times around with the thread just so you can see where that notch is. And just do that on the other side and we're good to go. Okay, so now it's time to do the leather. We're going to work with this wrung side, or like the suede side of the leather facing up. And you just want to take note of any like imperfections in the leather, if there's any holes or any weakness in the leather, both on the wrong side and on the right side. Here I've got some stitches from this pocket, so I want to make sure I'm not involving that in my pattern pieces that I cut. Okay, so I'm just going to take pieces C and B. Make sure that you're not mixing up the lining pieces because they do look similar. And we're just going to place this on one side. We want to make sure that the pattern pieces are face up. One thing you need to know about leather is that it doesn't have a grain line. So you can put these however you like. You don't have to worry about the grain line. The grain line is there for if ever you wanted to do this in a knit on this side, just so you know. You can go crazy with the positioning of these pieces. So I'm going to pop this down and I'm just going to use my ballpoint pen. You can use whatever you want to mark this, as long as it shows up. But I just like to use a pen. And make sure you mark your notches. And just make sure it's showing up, the line that you're tracing, before you take that piece off. And that's good. Okay, so I'm going to just pop that over here and let's do the other piece. So again, just making sure you're avoiding any imperfections in the leather. So now one thing that's really important to think about is that we have a left hand and a right hand. So if I were to place these pieces over here and cut them twice, in the same way that I traced them over here, I'd have two left hands. You have to make sure that you flip these pieces the opposite way so they're face down when you trace it the second time. So let's do that. Okay, so I'm just going to use regular scissors to cut this. Just make sure you're cutting on that line. Again, the seam allowance for the pattern is only 1/4 inch, so we've just got to be careful that we're not cutting into the piece. Also, if you've ever sewn with leather, or maybe you've never sewn with leather, but you will find that it's probably one of the most satisfying fabrics, I guess, to work with. Everything you make with it just looks so much better than if it were made in cloth. Okay. So I wouldn't throw this piece away. That can be used for something again later. And there we have our palm pieces. And just making sure that I've got like a set of opposing pieces here. All right, so let's get cutting the fur. Okay, so we're gonna get into cutting the fur, and I know that this may be a polarizing fabric for you guys, or maybe it's something you're just intimidated by. So I'm just gonna show you a little trick. But first of all, I just wanna point out that if you're not into using real fur, you can totally use faux fur for this. Another option in the pattern has a ribbed cuff, so if you don't want to have that aesthetic at all, then a ribbing is a good other option for the wrist finish. Now, I've just picked a fur that I like the look of with everything that I've got going on here, and I've deconstructed the piece. I'm just going to grab my piece G, which is the fur cuff piece. And I'm going to work with the skin side facing up. If you're working with faux fur, it's just going to be the weave side of the fabric. In that case, you can align the selvage of the pattern piece to the selvage of the fur. In our case here, really the thing you want to think about with fur is just the pile, meaning the direction of the fur. I've just got a little piece here that will just fit the pattern piece twice, and basically it's going to give me the one option of how I can position this. But if you are working with a bigger piece, just think about the direction that the fur is moving around that piece, and just try and find something that moves either up or down this direction of the pattern. All right, so I'm going to place this down, and again, grabbing my pen, and I'm just going to trace. I'll put a weight down. You can hold the pattern piece down too with your hands, but I'm just going to trace this piece with my pen. And I'll just say too, the same as with the leather, you're just keeping an eye out for any brittle pieces or spots in the fur, or any little holes that could become bigger holes as you wear your mittens. So just making sure you're cutting around spots like that. Okay, so now what you want to think about is this isn't going to get cut how we normally cut fabric, by just sort of chomping away at the fur with our scissors, because we want to keep the fur intact as much as possible. So what we need to do, whether you're working with real fur or fake fur, we're just going to be cutting the skin or the weave of the fabric if it's faux fur, and not cutting the fur. So you can use scissors for this, but first I'm just going to introduce you to the idea of using an X-Acto knife. And this would just be done along the line that you have traced with your pen. Now you'll notice with fur, it's done in such a beautiful way when they make fur garments, where they take these tiny little pieces of fur and they sew it together. And so you might find that cutting with the X-Acto knife past those little stitches may be difficult. You can just decide to use your scissors in that case. But I am just going to say, using an X-Acto knife just allows you easily to cut just the skin side. So what I'll do is just kind of pull tension across the piece in the area that I'm cutting. And be gentle, don't pull too much, because the fur, the skin is quite delicate and it can rip. Usually we're working with something vintage, so you just need to take care and treat it gently. All right, so I'm just going to show you now how this is looking. So it's just going to have a really nice cut along the skin, and we would not have affected the fur at all. So now if we wanted to do that with scissors, and I am finding this particular fur has so many stitches, it's a bit of a pain to use the X-Acto knife, so I'm going to switch. But when you're doing it with scissors, again, you're not kind of going in and cutting as you normally would with fabric. You're just kind of using the tip of the scissors and trying just to cut the skin. You may cut little bits of fur, but if you just go slowly, using the tip of your scissors, kind of just millimetering along, will be safe. And the fur will still be intact. So let's take a look at that. So you might have a little bit of fur that comes off, but for the most part, it's all intact there. So feel free to use your scissors. All right. Okay, so now you just want to kind of shake out your fur, get any little loose bits off, because you're going to find that this is going to start floating around and get all over your house if you don't. And you might even want to just pass a vacuum over the pieces. Yeah, I don't know if you can see it, but there's like a snowstorm of fur here. But yeah, so once these are done, we're going to get moving on to our lining. Okay, so lining time. We are going to cut pieces D, E, and F. Again, make sure you don't switch those up with your other outer pattern pieces. All right, so this is basically like cutting any fabric that has a selvage. If you've never done this before, then let me show you how. You're going to place those pattern pieces onto the double folded fabric. So we want to have 2 layers of each of these pieces. And use your measuring tape and align your selvage to the grain line, making sure that it's equidistant at the top and at the bottom. So let's say I'm 4.5 inches away from my line from the selvage edge at the top. I also need to be 4.5 inches away at the bottom. So I'm just going to shift this piece, so that, there we go. That has a grain line that is equidistant to my selvage. So I'm going to do that for each of those pieces, and I'm just going to trace each pattern with chalk or any marking device around the pattern onto my fabric, and I'm just going to mark those notches. All right, so with that, I am going to cut this out. And once I cut this out, I'm also gonna do exactly the same thing I did on the lining onto this insulation fabric. This is a fabric that just helps to keep warmth or coolness inside of whatever it is you're making. So because my hands are going to emit warmth, this metal part is going to end up facing my hand and it's going to just sort of bounce it right back at my hand. And so that's going to go in between the lining and the outer layer, and you won't see it. It'll be sandwiched in between, and it's going to make these mittens super toasty. So if you want to do that, if you're living in a really cold climate, then try this out. This is a Pellon brand. It's called Insul Fleece, and you can find it online if your local fabric store doesn't sell it. I can leave a link in the description. All right, so let's get cutting this, and then I'll cut the insulation. Okay, now with your notches, I'm going to suggest that we just cut very small little snips at the depth of like 1/8 of an inch. We just want to have a slight indication of where that notch is. The seam allowance is 1/4 inch. I know I've said it a few times, but just remember, because when we are sewing, we can't have a hole in our seam because our notch was cut too big. All right, I'm going to give you another option for your notches if you don't want to cut into your fabric. As you're cutting the fabric out and you approach your notch, cut outwards. So let's take a look. So I'm reaching my notch and I'm just going to cut outward like that. So the difference is if I'm doing outward notches, I need to cut them as I'm cutting the piece. If I'm doing the inward notches, I would cut those after all the pieces are cut. All right, so I've got my 3 lining pieces, and I'm going to do the same thing, as I said, with the insulation, and then it's time to sew. Alright guys, that's it. We're done cutting out the Atlas Mitten. I hope you learned some new tips on working with upcycled materials. In the next video, I'm going to be showing you how to sew the mitten. So I'll be walking you through step by step how to do it and giving you some tips along the way on working with these fabrics. In the meantime, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a little thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you over in the next video. Bye!